Welcome to FundaChat, everyone. My name is Letzler. I'm Head of Legal for Genoa Underwriting Managers, former advocate of the High Court, and we are going to talk to Greg Whittaker today. Who are you?
Thanks, Maud. I'm Greg Whittaker. I'm an actuary. I've got about 25 years of experience in quantification of damages in personal injury matters. I also have a PhD in statistics and actuarial science.
So Greg mentioned to me, I think it was yesterday or the day before, about a new case that recently was reported regarding life tables and how that would impact on future life expectancy. And if, like me, you are pro-defendant and defend doctors and hospitals, then of course that makes a big difference going forward in how we calculate future medical expenses. So, Greg, can you tell us a bit more about the case and what made you interested in it?
Yes, I think just before I get into the specifics of the case, it's just good to look at what is a life table per se, just for people who aren't familiar with it. So it's something that actuaries use to calculate a present value of future damages. And from the life table, you read off probabilities of survival each year. So actuaries always talk about using a year-by-year approach when they calculate damages. And the life table feeds directly into that year-by-year approach where you read off the probabilities that a claimant will survive either 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years into the future. So the derivation of that table is quite important, and from that you often will be able to calculate things like life expectancy, which is medical experts often talk about the life expectancy of a plaintiff. From that life expectancy, the actuary will ordinarily then select a life table to use and then do their calculations.
Okay, so for those of us who are not that clever, basically it means how long you're going to live and how much money we would have to pay as an insurer or as a government, depending on a person's life expectancy.
Correct, because the case law says that you only calculate damages for as long as the person's expected to be alive. So there's no compensation for what they call the lost years. So if somebody has let's say your normal life expectancy is 50 years, and then as a result of a medical incident, for example, your life expectancy may have been reduced to 30 years. There's no compensation for that additional 20 years that you lose in terms of life expectancy. So your calculation is just based on the 30-year revised life expectancy. So
And
the
is
life
that
expectancy
only,
post-incident.
sorry, is that only in South Africa or is that worldwide that the lost years aren't accounted for?
So I think in the UK there's been a little bit of case law development in that regard, but I think generally the trend is to calculate it based on the post-incident life expectancy.
Now, our life tables that we currently use, where do they come from? How were they designed, and what are their purpose?
So and this is what this case talks about, is that they relied on an old South African life table. They were derived in 1984 and 1986 from the census back then. Since then, Statistics South Africa hasn't produced any complete life tables for the South African population. So we're sitting with a problem where we also have there's been a lot of things that have occurred since 1984, 1986 in terms of transition into democracy, and also obviously the HIV/AIDS pandemic was a huge issue in the 90s and the early 2000s. So there's been a lot of things that you have to be aware of if you're constructing tables, because ideally what one should be working with is a employed lives mortality table. So most of the people that we calculate damages for are employed, and ideally you should be working on something that represents people who are in employment, because there's something called the healthy worker effect. So people who are able to work or who have worked for a few years, they generally have better life expectancy than people who are part of the normal general population. So those are the sort of things that need to be factored in. So one of the reasons why they rely on the old South African life tables, and specifically they used to have population group tables. So they used to the table that's in use often is the white population table, and that's sort of a proxy to employed lives mortality. So there hasn't really been any studies regarding that, but I have been working on that in the last few months in terms of using data from a whole lot of sources to just test whether this is a reasonable table to use or not.
And in this particular case, the argument centered around the white man's table, if I can put it that way, and then a township table, so to speak. And the court found that to be unreasonable because they said it was unconstitutional in terms of the distinguish or the differences between the two. And if I remember correctly, I think it was about a 5.5 year difference between the two, 66 and 71.5. If one looks at both of those tables, the one of 71 and the one of 66, and the court ended up deciding on the higher scale of 71.5, do you think either of those two tables were suitable in this particular case in determining damages?
Yeah, look, I think because there's no alternative table that's available. I think there was also a prior judgment back in the Singh Ibrahim judgment, which was the first matter where they actually delved into the life tables in more detail. Where I think the Supreme Court even said that one should remove racial bias from the tables, and then they went for life table 2, which is the same as the South African life tables for the white population group. So there was already an indication back then. I think that judgment was about 16 years old already. So they did mention it in this current judgment, but I think the bottom line is we really need to construct more up-to-date tables, and there is good data out there. The Government Employees Pension Fund, for example, they've conducted I think a 13-year experience study on people who are actually employed in the public service and what do their mortality rates look like. And I mean, they employ, I think, around about 1.3 million people are in the public service. So over 13 years, you've got sort of 13 million years of life exposure from which you can construct pretty good tables. So one can use that, and we are trying to use that to now overlay that on a population mortality table and calculate a more reasonable table for compensation claims.
If one looks at that data compared to the two tables that was used in, I think it was the Tobi case, how does that research compare to the two tables that were used?
So my preliminary findings are it's actually quite close to the life table 2. So especially there's a slight shift in mortality. So basically the employed lives mortality from the government pension fund is slightly lighter than the population tables from 84, 86. And it's actually quite an interesting, it's almost sort of a constant difference, but we're still busy fine-tuning all of that analysis.
So you could predict if somebody works in public service how long they're going to live.
Oh, so they've done that. I mean the government's got it's in the actual valuation report. So they've done the actual study that they looked at mortality rates from 2012 to 2023, and they were able to derive their own mortality table. So it's probably the most comprehensive study of employed lives that I know of. There was a paper a few years ago that also looked at group life mortality experience, but the period that was done, it's quite difficult to compare that to population tables because of the HIV pandemic at that stage. It's very difficult to tease out the difference.
Considering that one uses that for quantification of damages, and I think maybe this is the difference between, say, for instance, a RAF matter where you have future medical expenses catered for by an undertaking versus a medical negligence case. So if you quantify damages, what becomes important in the life tables? Obviously, I would think that everything from the wheelchair up to the time they would spend with a caregiver would become important.
Yeah, everything is important, and the important thing for experts is the timing of these items. So, they need to. Sometimes experts will list, let's say, various items, but then they don't always give necessarily a replacement period for the item. So, then what do you do as an actuary? You have to get back to the expert, ask them what do they mean. Is it a once-off expense or a lifelong expense? And these things all sort of delay the processing of a claim. So it's very useful for experts to have like a good idea of what they need to provide, and especially the timing of the timing of various items that may be required, and then also sometimes just the chances that the item will be required, because you
Yeah.
won't always necessarily use every single item. Some people, some experts will just give sort of literally just brainstorm every possible expense possible, and not necessarily attach the chances that you're actually going to need that expense regularly or and so on. So
no, I agree with you.
I mean, no, your attorneys normally
Yeah.
or advocates will normally adjust it for contingencies at some stage, but sometimes it's useful to, if an expert's already given some thought as to, what's the likelihood of this item being required.
No, I completely agree with you. I remember sitting with one of the big plaintiff attorney firms, and I was defense counsel on the matter, and there was an IOP that had to happen potentially somewhere in the future. And I said to my opponent, okay, but there's only a 15% chance of this happening, and it's only going to happen at 60, and I don't see it anywhere in your actuarial calculations. So please, can you fix it? So that we can get the proper quantification of it. And I think that's important for experts to remember. And the difference between RAF and METMAL matters is you have to give a possibility of when it will be needed. You have to include the costing of the item, even if it's current costing. Otherwise, you have to go and look it up. And I mean, so orthotics, whatever you are recommending, needs to have a price. It needs to have a percentage use. It needs to have how many times it's going to be repeated. And up until what lifetime, because you might find that a person will need a wheelchair, but then you also recommend a caregiver. So the wheelchair might only be possible until they're like 70, and then thereafter they'll be in a care home. And very few people actually recommend a care home. I had a matter where we reduced the quantification by about 5 million because we put the person in a care home rather than providing all these assistive devices. So you have to give potential opportunities like that for you as an actuary to quantify it properly.
Yeah, and also, two things picking up from what you just said now. I think the one interesting thing is, especially on costing, so experts will sometimes provide the costs at a specific point in time, and then there might be delays in the case, and then 2 years later you're sitting with you having to do the actual calculation, and those costs might have changed quite substantially. So just adjusting those costs with inflation might not be enough. So it might be, sometimes it's good to get an indication of how the costs might have increased in the intervening period. That's the one thing. And then the other thing about like lifelong costs in particular, for example, you often see physiotherapists, they'll say the person needs 20 sessions of physiotherapy per annum for life. Now, I don't know, does that actually mimic reality? Because, if you're like currently 30, yes, maybe you'll have 20 sessions, but when you're the age of 60 or 70, it may be more, it may be less, but it won't necessarily be constant. And there's been a little bit of research on like sort of like the development of costs by age, and you generally do see a tapering down of species, something like physiotherapy costs. I've personally looked at that in a large medical scheme where we've looked at how some of these costs run down over a person's lifetime. So it's not just necessarily a constant as experts sometimes say. So there's sometimes a little bit of the hypothetical model versus realities often there's a bit of a gap there.
Yeah, so I think to close off, remember to make your report logical, clear, and have proper percentages, estimates, and make quantification easier for the actuary. So that at the end of the day, the amount of money that's payable makes sense, especially if you're on the plaintiff side. Defendants are more likely to settle with you if there is liability, if they can make sense of the quantification. Thank you for joining us at FundaChat today.